Captain Eric "Buck" Rogers guided his sleek starfighter through the debris field, narrowly avoiding a chunk of twisted metal that had once been part of a mighty warship. Sweat beaded on his brow as his eyes darted across the scanner readouts. "Come on, baby. Hold together," he muttered to his ship, the Aegis. Alarms blared in the cockpit as the inertial dampers struggled to compensate for his wild maneuvering. Buck ignored them, focused only on the alien fighter hot on his tail. A plasma bolt sizzled past his canopy, nearly taking off the Aegis's starboard wing. Buck juked hard to port, then slammed the throttle forward, racing toward a dense cluster of wreckage. At the last second, he cut power and fired maneuvering thrusters, flipping the ship on its axis. As the alien fighter shot past, Buck squeezed the trigger. The Aegis pulse cannon spat blue-white bolts of superheated plasma into the enemy's aft shields until they popped like a soap bubble. Armor boiled away and the craft exploded in a silent fireball. Buck let out a whoop of victory, then winced as pain lanced through his side. Glancing down, he saw a shard of metal protruding from his flight suit, just below the ribs. Probably a piece of his own damn ship, he thought wryly. The cockpit seal must have ruptured in that last skirmish. "Aegis to Ranger 1, come in," Buck said, trying to keep his voice steady as he switched on the comm. "Hostiles neutralized, but I've taken damage. Requesting permission to RTB, over." Static crackled across the line, and for a moment, Buck feared the worst. Then a familiar voice broke through. "Negative, Aegis," said Colonel Trent, commander of the Earth Defense Fleet's 23rd Ranger Squadron. "We're still neck-deep in squids up here. Regroup with the Valkyries and escort the troop transports to the surface. Those jarheads are our only shot at taking out the bug's ground batteries." "Roger that," Buck replied through gritted teeth. Trent was right. If they didn't knock out those planetary cannons, the fleet would get torn to shreds as soon as they entered orbit. Moving to rendezvous with the Valkyries now. Aegis out. Firing his thrusters, Buck angled toward the blinding chaos of the ongoing space battle. Flights of human fighters danced and swirled, exchanging fire with the swarming alien craft. In the distance, the angular silhouettes of Earth's battleships advanced in tight formation, their mighty rail cannons and missile batteries sending streams of ordnance into the enemy fleet. And at the center of it all, the bloated mass of the alien queenship, disgorging endless waves of fighters, bombers, and boarding pods. It was like some monstrous hive, spewing forth soldier drones to overwhelm humanity's defenses through sheer numbers. Buck gritted his teeth against the pain in his side and pushed his throttle to the max. They had to hold the line here in the cold void above Juno Colony. If this planet fell, the bugs would have a perfect staging ground to assault the core worlds. Billions would die, enslaved or devoured by the insatiable hive. He couldn't let that happen. As Buck approached the embattled troop transports, a fresh wave of alien fighters fell upon the Valkyrie squadron with ruthless purpose. The women pilots gave as good as they got, their sleek Raptor-class starfighters dancing nimbly between the lumbering enemy craft, pulse cannons and missiles cutting down scores of the vile things. But there were just too many, and one by one the human ships winked out under the onslaught. "Valkyrie, lead to all units," came a strained female voice over the comm. "We can't hold them! Aegis, where the hell are you?" "Right here, Valerie," Buck called out as he opened fire, his guns ripping into the alien fighter screen. "Let's send these bugs back to whatever festering hole they crawled out of." Valerie's Raptor fell in beside him, plasma cannons blazing. Together they tore a path through the enemy formation, giving the troop ships a fighting chance to reach the planet's surface. Suddenly, a massive plasma blast struck Valerie's fighter, vaporizing her shields in a blinding flash. "I'm hit!" she cried, voice laced with pain and fear. "Port engine is gone. Life support failing." "Buck, it's been an honor." "Don't you dare die on me, woman!" Buck shouted back, blinking away tears. "Eject! Punch out now!" But it was too late. He watched helplessly as Valerie's Raptor, trailing smoke and debris, rammed straight into the heart of the alien fighter swarm. The resulting explosion consumed a dozen enemy ships in a roiling fireball. "You magnificent bitch," Buck whispered, his heart breaking even as he saluted her sacrifice. Valerie had given her life to clear a path for the transports. He wouldn't let it be in vain. Alone now, Buck plunged into the fray with reckless abandon, lasers and missiles sending alien craft tumbling and burning on all sides. His vision narrowed, his whole being focused on mowing down the vile things, heedless of the alarms wailing in his cockpit or the blood soaking his flight suit. He had to hold them off just a little longer. With a bone-jarring impact, an alien plasma bolt punched through the Aegis's failing shields and slammed into the fuselage. Consoles exploded in a shower of sparks as the cabin decompressed, the escaping air tearing the shard of metal from Buck's side in a spray of blood. Warning klaxons blared, nearly drowned out by the roar of wind. Fighting to stay conscious, Buck pawed at the ejection lever. The canopy blew away and rocket motors fired, blasting his command chair free of the disintegrating ship. Then a chunk of burning debris smashed into his helmet and everything went black. Buck awoke with a gasp, his eyes flying open. He tried to sit up, but searing pain shot him through his body, forcing him back down. Blinking away tears, he found himself staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling, a cool breeze wafting across his bare skin. Bare skin? Buck's brow furrowed as he realized he was naked beneath a thin sheet. He appeared to be lying on some kind of bed in a sparsely furnished room. Sunlight streamed in through tall, crystalline windows. Where the hell was he? The last thing Buck remembered was ejecting from the Aegis as it came apart around him. After that, nothing. How had he gotten here? Where was here? The sound of a door opening drew his attention, and Buck turned his head to see a woman striding into the room. No, not a woman. A goddess made flesh. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with flawless olive skin and a wild mane of fiery red hair. Her face was all high cheekbones and full lips, her eyes a striking amber color. She wore a sleeveless tunic of some gossamer material that clung to her generous curves and left her long, muscular legs bare. Around her waist hung a belt of golden links from which a small dagger dangled. Buck's mouth went dry as he drank in the sight of her. She was quite possibly the most beautiful creature he had ever laid eyes on. And yet there was something undeniably dangerous about her, a coiled lethality in her easy grace. The woman noticed him staring, and her lips quirked in a small smile. "Ah, you're awake," she said, her voice a smoky purr. "How do you feel, Earther?" Buck tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. The woman moved to a side table and poured a glass of water from a crystalline decanter, then approached the bed. Sliding a hand behind his head, she lifted him gently and held the glass to his lips. Buck drank greedily, the cool water soothing his parched throat. When he was done, the woman set the glass aside and lowered him back down. "My name is Alara," she said, settling on the edge of the bed. "You are in the city of Themyscira, on the planet Hypatia. My sisters and I rescued you after your ship was destroyed." "Hypatia?" Buck said, his brow furrowing. "I've never heard of it. What system is this?" "I'm not surprised," Alara replied. "We are far from your Earth in the Artemis cluster. My people, the Hypatians, have kept our world hidden for generations, a sanctuary against the ravages of the galaxy." Buck struggled to process this. The Artemis cluster was uncharted space, a vast expanse of swirling nebulae and rogue stars. Few who ventured into the cluster ever returned. And yet, if this woman spoke true, there was an entire civilization thriving in its depths. "I have to get back," Buck said urgently, trying to rise. "My squadron, the fleet, we were fighting the Hive, holding the line at Juno Colony. They need me." Alara placed a gentle but firm hand on his chest, pushing him back down. "Peace, Earther," she said softly. "You are in no condition to fight. Your wounds were grievous. It's a miracle you survived it all." Buck glanced down at himself and blanched. His torso was swathed in bandages, angry red lines of half-healed lacerations peeking out here and there. He could only imagine the patchwork of bruises hidden beneath. "How long was I out?" he asked hoarsely. 3 days, Alara replied. "You drifted in the void for some time before our scout ship found your escape pod and brought you here." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I'm sorry, but we found no other survivors in the battle's debris field." Buck squeezed his eyes shut as grief welled up in his chest. Valerie, Colonel Trent, the rest of the Rangers, all gone. And the fleet had likely fared no better against the Hive's onslaught. Juno Colony was lost. The bugs now had their beachhead to assault Earth itself. "I failed," he whispered brokenly. "I failed them all." Alara's hand found his and squeezed gently. "You fought bravely," she said. "You all did. I saw the wreckage, the cost in blood and metal your people paid. Whatever comes next, hold fast to that. Your courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten." Buck opened his eyes and met her amber gaze. There was compassion there, and empathy. This woman was a warrior, he realized. She understood the pain of loss, the weight of duty and honor. He squeezed her hand back, taking solace in that connection, fleeting though it was. Then he sighed and looked away. "I appreciate your kind words," he said, "but sympathy won't stop the hive. As soon as I'm able, I have to find a way back to the front. Earth needs every able body if we're to have any hope of weathering the coming storm." Alara was silent for a long moment. "What if I told you there was another way?" she said at last. "A means to defeat the hive, once and for all?" Buck looked at her sharply. "What do you mean? How?" The Hypatian woman stood and began to pace. "My people are different from yours," she said slowly. "We have abilities, gifts that set us apart. For generations, we have used them only to maintain our isolation, to keep our world secret and safe. But now," she turned to face him, her expression fierce, "I have seen what the hive does to the worlds it conquers, the suffering it inflicts. And I know my people have the power to stop it. But my mother, the queen, refuses to get involved. She fears drawing the bugs' attention, bringing their wrath down upon Hypatia." Alara clenched her fists. "I've tried to convince her that nowhere will be safe if the hive isn't stopped, that we have a duty to aid the galaxy against this threat. But she will not hear me." She moved back to the bed and leaned down, her face inches from Buck's. "But with an outsider, a decorated hero of Earth, to support my arguments, she may yet be swayed." Buck stared up at her, hardly daring to breathe. "You're saying your people could turn the tide against the hive? How? What abilities do you have?" Alara's lips curved in a mysterious smile. "Come with me to the palace and I will show you." Buck had to lean heavily on Alara as they made their way through the winding streets of Themyscira, his injuries still far from healed. But he hardly noticed the pain, so entranced was he by the alien city. Graceful towers of gleaming metal and crystal soared overhead, linked by arching skyways. Lush gardens and burbling fountains dotted every courtyard. The air was filled with the scents of exotic flowers and the lilting sounds of birdsong. And everywhere Buck saw the Hypatians themselves. Tall, muscular women with bronze skin and flowing hair in every shade of the rainbow. They wore intricately embroidered tunics, glittering jewels at their throats and wrists. A few carried long, curved blades at their hips, moving with the deadly grace of born warriors. The women regarded Buck with open curiosity as he passed, murmuring to each other behind their hands. He felt distinctly self-conscious in the simple tunic and sandals Alara had provided. Next to these Amazonian beauties, he was a shabby sight indeed. Soon they arrived at the palace, a towering structure of opalescent stone that seemed to glow from within. Armored guards nodded to Alara as they passed through the soaring archway, spears held at crisp attention. Inside was a vast audience chamber, its vaulted ceiling supported by fluted columns. Intricate mosaics adorned the walls, depicting heroic figures and mythic beasts. At the far end, a wide dais held a massive throne of carved amber, upon which sat the most regal woman Buck had ever seen. Queen Hippolyta was a figure of timeless beauty, her face unlined despite the wisdom in her piercing emerald eyes. Her hair, a lustrous silver, was bound in an elaborate braid woven with golden threads. She wore a gown of shimmering white, a golden gorget at her throat. An aura of power and authority seemed to radiate from her very being. "Daughter," she greeted Alara coolly as they approached, "why have you brought this outsider before me? You know my feelings on involving ourselves in the galaxy's troubles." Alara bowed deeply. "Mother, I beg you to hear me out. This man is Captain Eric Rogers of the Earth Defense Fleet. He and his people are locked in a desperate battle against the hive. Without aid, their homeworld will fall, and the bugs will have a clear path to consume the rest of the galaxy, including Hypatia." Hippolyta's gaze flicked to Buck, raking over his battered form. "You vouch for this man, Alara? You believe his cause worthy of our involvement? Of the risk to our people?" "I do," Alara said firmly. "I have seen his courage, his willingness to sacrifice all for the safety of others. And more than that," she hesitated, then pushed on, "I believe he may be the one foretold in the prophecy, the off-worlder who will father a new generation of Hypatians, stronger than any before." Murmurs ran through the assembled court. Hippolyta's eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. "A bold claim, daughter, and one not lightly made." She leaned forward, studying Buck intently. Tell me, Earther, what do you know of Hypatian biology, of how we propagate our race? Buck swallowed nervously, very aware of all the eyes upon him. I know only what Alara has told me, he said carefully, that your people have abilities beyond those of normal humans, gifts that make you exceptionally strong and resilient. Hippolyta nodded. All true, but there is more. Hypatians are all female, you see. We have no males of our own race. To reproduce, we must seek out mates from other species, mates whose genetic structure is compatible with our own. She smiled thinly. Not just any genes will do, of course. We require traits of strength, courage, intelligence. Only the finest specimens are chosen to father our children. Alara stepped forward, her chin held high. The prophecy speaks of an off-worlder of unparalleled genetic perfection, whose union with a Hypatian will produce a child destined to lead our people to greatness. She turned to Buck, her amber eyes shining. I believe you are that man, Eric Rogers. Buck felt a rush of heat to his face as the implications of Alara's words sank in. Him? The father of some prophesied savior? It was absurd. He was just a soldier, a pilot, not some paragon of genetic perfection. And yet, the way Alara looked at him with such fierce conviction in her eyes, the way the queen herself now studied him appraisingly, as if seeing him in a new light. Could there be some truth to this prophecy after all? I am honored by your belief in me, Buck said haltingly, but surely there are others better suited. I'm just a man, no different than any other. Modest too, Hippolyta mused, a rare trait among heroes. She leaned back in her throne, steepling her fingers. Alara's instincts are seldom wrong. If she believes you are the one foretold, I am inclined to trust her judgment. The queen fixed Buck with a piercing stare. But prophecy alone is not enough. If you are to win our aid against the Hive, you must first prove your worth. Undergo the trials of the Hypatian warrior and show us the strength of your mind, body, and spirit. Buck squared his shoulders, ignoring the twinge of pain from his half-healed wounds. I'll do whatever I have to. My people are counting on me. The whole galaxy is counting on me. I won't let them down. Alara laid a hand on his arm, her touch sending a tingle up his spine. I will stand with you, Eric Rogers. Together we will face the trials, and together we will forge a new future for both our peoples. Hippolyta nodded solemnly. So be it. The trials begin at dawn. Rest well, Earther. You will have need of all your strength. As Buck let Alara lead him from the throne room, his mind raced. The trials of the Hypatian warrior. He could only imagine what they entailed. Tests of combat prowess, most likely. Feats of endurance and skill. But he would not falter, no matter the challenge. For Earth, for the billions of lives hanging in the balance, he would prove his worth to these Amazons. He would win their alliance against the Hive. And perhaps, just perhaps, he would find something more along the way. A higher calling, a greater destiny than he had ever dreamed. At Alara's side, beneath the light of an alien sun, anything seemed possible. The first rays of dawn found Buck on a wide, sandy expanse behind the palace walls. He wore only a loincloth of soft leather, his bare chest and arms gleaming with oil. Across the arena stood Alara, similarly attired, her red hair bound back in a tight braid. The first trial tests your martial prowess, Hippolyta declared from her seat of honor in the stands. Scores of Hypatian warriors looked on, their expressions ranging from curious to overtly scornful. Prove your worth in single combat against our finest champion. At the queen's signal, Alara strode forward, drawing a pair of curved short swords from sheaths at her hips. She twirled them expertly, the rising sun flashing along their razor edges. Buck swallowed hard. He had trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat, both in the fleet and before, scrapping in the rough dives of Earth's outer colonies. But he had never faced a warrior like Alara. The strength and speed granted by Hypatian physiology, combined with what were clearly years of intensive training, she would be a formidable opponent indeed. Sensing his hesitation, Alara cocked a mocking eyebrow. Having second thoughts, Earther? It's not too late to bow out, to admit you're not the man the prophecy speaks of after all. Buck narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening. Not on your life, he growled. He snatched up a pair of swords from a nearby rack, testing their heft. The grip was unfamiliar, but he would adapt. He had to. They began to circle each other, blades held low and ready. Alara feinted, testing his reactions. Buck parried smoothly, then launched an attack of his own. Their swords clashed in a ringing cacophony, almost too fast to follow. Alara was every bit as skilled as Buck had feared, her blades a whirling dervish that seemed to come at him from all angles at once. He gave ground before her onslaught, barely managing to keep her swords from his flesh. But he was learning her patterns, the cadence of her movements. He began to anticipate her strikes, to counter them more effectively. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles burning with effort. But slowly the tide began to turn. Sensing the change, Alara redoubled her attacks, her face a mask of fierce concentration. But Buck met her blow for blow, his own swords a blur of silver. He drove her back across the sand, the clang of steel and the rasp of labored breath the only sounds. With a final desperate lunge, Alara overextended. Buck twisted aside and lashed out, his blade scoring a thin red line across her upper arm. First blood. A gasp ran through the crowd as Alara stumbled back, her sword falling from nerveless fingers. Buck moved in to press his advantage, only to drop his own blade and catch her by the shoulders, steadying her. "Yield," he said gently. "The match is mine." For a moment, Alara glared at him, her amber eyes flashing with anger and humiliation. Then, to his surprise, she began to laugh. "Well fought, Eric Rogers," she said, her voice rich with grudging respect. "You are full of surprises." She raised her voice to be heard by all. "I concede the bout. The victory is yours." The gathered Hypatians erupted in a buzz of excited chatter as Buck helped Alara to her feet. Hippolyta looked on, her expression unreadable. "The first trial is past," the queen said at last, "but there are 2 more to face. Prepare yourself, Earther. The true tests are yet to come." As Buck followed Alara from the arena to tend their wounds and ready for the next challenge, he couldn't help but wonder what else these Amazons had in store. But one thing was certain: he would not fail. He could not. The fate of Earth and the galaxy itself depended on it. The second trial was one of endurance and fortitude. Buck and Alara, their wounds bandaged and their resolve steeled, ventured deep into the wild jungles that ringed the Hypatian capital. Their task, to navigate the treacherous terrain and reach the sacred heart tree at the forest's center, all while braving the myriad dangers that lurked in the shadowed depths. They set out at midday, the sun a baleful eye glaring down from a sky of beaten brass. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and heavy with moisture. In minutes, Buck's skin was slick with sweat, his simple tunic plastered to his body. But Alara seemed unaffected, striding ahead with tireless purpose, her long legs eating up the ground. Buck marveled at her stamina, the coiled strength in her muscular frame. The Hypatians were truly built for this land, this planet that would crush a lesser being. As they ventured deeper into the jungle, the trees pressed close on all sides. Ancient trunks festooned with vines and creepers. Strange animal calls echoed in the green gloom. The cries of beasts Buck could only imagine. He glimpsed flashes of movement in the undergrowth, but nothing he could identify. Alara held up a hand, halting him in his tracks. "Listen," she hissed, her body tense. "We are not alone." Buck strained his ears, trying to pick out anything unusual amid the cacophony of the jungle. Then he heard it, a low guttural growl coming from somewhere off to their right. Slowly he turned his head and found himself staring into a pair of slitted yellow eyes. The beast emerged from the foliage, its body a ripple of midnight fur over corded muscle. It had the build of a great cat, sleek and powerful, but its head was distinctly reptilian, all scales and fangs and cold, alien intelligence. "A hooded stalker," Alara breathed, "apex predator of the Hypatian wilds. Few who encounter one survive to tell the tale." The stalker prowled closer, its growl building to a rumbling snarl. Buck reached for the long knife at his belt, knowing it would be little use against such a creature. But he would not die cowering. Alara's hand on his arm stopped him. "No," she said softly. "Watch." To Buck's astonishment, she stepped forward, directly into the stalker's path. The beast froze, its snarl cutting off abruptly. Slowly, deliberately, Alara sank to her knees, bowing her head in supplication. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then incredibly, the stalker mirrored her posture. lowering its great head and dropping to its belly in the loam. A rumbling purr built in its throat as Alara reached out and laid a gentle hand on its brow. "Respect," she said quietly, glancing back at Buck. "That is the key to surviving here. The beasts of the jungle are proud and powerful, but they are not evil. Show them deference, and they will grant you passage." Buck shook his head in wonder as Alara rose and the stalker melted back into the undergrowth. "You never cease to amaze me," he said honestly. Alara flashed him a quick smile, her amber eyes dancing. "The true wonder is this land and all the life in it. I have studied the ways of the jungle since I was a child. It is as much a part of me as my own breath and blood." They pressed on, Buck following Alara's lead as she traced a winding path through the dense foliage. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, they broke through a last screen of vines. And there, rising in the center of a small clearing, stood the heart tree. It was a titan of the forest, its trunk so wide a dozen men could not have encircled it with their arms. Spreading branches, hung with trailing moss, soared hundreds of feet into the air, and set into the massive bowl, at chest height, was a softly glowing crystalline shape, a perfect representation of a Hypatian heart. "The source of our people's power," Alara said reverently, "the wellspring from which we draw our strength, our long lives, our connection to this world. Legends say it was a gift from the goddess Hera herself in ancient days long past." Hesitantly, Buck reached out and laid his hand on the heart. It was warm to the touch, pulsing gently like a living thing. A feeling of peace, of rightness flowed through him. "You have done well, Eric Rogers," Alara said softly. "To reach the heart, you have proven your respect for the land and your oneness with its primal forces. The second trial is past." Buck let his hand fall away, a sense of awe still thrumming through him. He had thought this trial a simple test of endurance, of strength. But it had been so much more, a lesson in humility, in attunement to the world around him. He felt changed in some fundamental way. "One final trial awaits," Alara reminded him gently, "the trial of spirit. Are you ready?" Buck met her gaze squarely, a new resolve firming his spine. "Lead on," he said. "Let us finish this." The third and final trial was to take place at moonrise in the great hall of the palace. As Buck waited for Alara to collect him, he found himself pacing restlessly, his mind awhirl. What sort of spiritual test could the Hypatians have devised? How could he prove the worthiness of his very soul? When Alara finally appeared, she was not alone. Two other Hypatian women flanked her, one tall and lithe with ebony skin, the other compact and muscular with a wild mane of auburn hair. Both were strikingly beautiful, and both regarded Buck with a speculative intensity that made him feel distinctly on display. "Eric Rogers," Alara said formally, "may I present my sisters, Nakia, mistress of the mystic arts, and Bryn, high priestess of the goddess. They will be your guides in this final trial." Buck bowed deeply to the women, feeling suddenly inadequate in his simple tunic and sandals. "I am honored," he managed, "but what is to be my test? How am I to prove my spirit?" Nakia smiled enigmatically. "All will be revealed in time," she said, her voice a low, smoky purr. "Come, the moon rises. We must not keep the goddess waiting." She and Bryn turned and glided away, leaving Buck no choice but to follow. Alara fell into step beside him, her presence a silent comfort. He was glad beyond words to have her at his side. The great hall was dark as they entered, lit only by the flicker of torches along the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, rich and heady. At the far end of the chamber, a wide circular dais stood, inlaid with intricate patterns of gold and lapis lazuli. Nakia and Bryn took up positions on either side of the dais, their faces shadowed and solemn. Alara guided Buck to stand at its center, then stepped back, melting into the darkness. "Eric Rogers of Earth," Nakia intoned, her voice ringing out in the stillness. "You come before us seeking to prove your worth, to claim a place among the Hypatian people, as foretold in the prophecy. But to do so, you must first face the shadows within your own heart and emerge transformed." She raised her hands and the torches guttered and died. Darkness fell like a shroud, thick and absolute. Buck fought down a surge of primal fear, forcing himself to breathe evenly. This was part of the trial. He had to trust in the process, in the wisdom of these women. Slowly, a soft glow began to emanate from the patterns beneath his feet. The light grew, spreading up and out until Buck found himself standing in a shimmering sphere of radiance. Images began to form in the air around him, drawn from the depths of his own mind. He saw his childhood on the hardscrabble mining colony of Titan, the long days of toil and privation. He saw his mother's face, careworn, but always smiling, always ready with a word of encouragement or comfort. He saw his father, stern and taciturn, forever pushing him to be stronger, faster, smarter. The images shifted, and he was in the cockpit of his first starfighter, his heart pounding with the thrill of flight. He relived his early missions, the camaraderie of his squadron mates, the flush of hard-won victories against the Hive. But then the shadows crept in, the losses and failures. Friends shot down in flames, worlds consumed by the implacable advance of the bugs. He saw Juno Colony again, overrun and abandoned, the fleet in ruins. Saw Valerie's face, twisted in agony as her fighter disintegrated around her. "No!" Buck cried out, his voice raw. "I won't let it end like this. I won't let their deaths be in vain." "Then fight," Bryn's voice came to him as if from a great distance. "Fight, not just for your comrades, but for all life, for the future itself." The light around him flared, blindingly bright. When it faded, Buck found himself somewhere else entirely. A desolate plain strewn with the wreckage of war. Shattered hulks of starships lay half-buried in the blasted earth, scorched bones littering the ground between. And on the horizon, a seething tide of chitin and claws and snapping mandibles. The Hive in all its horrific might. They surged toward him, a chittering, ravenous mass, ready to strip the flesh from his bones and feast on his marrow. Buck stood his ground, fear and revulsion twisting in his gut. But beneath it all, a core of steel held firm. He was a warrior, a defender of Earth and all her colonies. He would fight to his last breath to keep the bugs from his homeworld, from all the worlds of the galaxy. A sword appeared in his hand, its blades shimmering with an inner fire. He raised it high, a rallying cry on his lips, and behind him, an army took shape. Row upon row of spectral figures, drawn from every race and species, human and Hypatian, Ked and Zerath, all the myriad peoples of the stars. They stood with him, united in common cause, ready to face the darkness as one. "For Earth!" Buck cried, his voice ringing across the plain. "For the galaxy! For the light!" And with a roar that shook the heavens, the army charged to meet the Hive, Buck leading the way, his sword flashing like a beacon in the gloom. The vision shattered, and Buck found himself back in the great hall, on his knees, gasping for breath. Slowly, he became aware of Nakia and Bryn standing over him, their faces wreathed in smiles. "You have passed the final trial," Nakia said softly. "You have faced your fears, your doubts, and in so doing, you have proven the strength of your spirit. The prophecy is fulfilled." Alara was there, helping him to his feet, her amber eyes shining with pride and something more. "Eric Rogers," she said formally, "you have shown yourself worthy to stand among us, and to father the next generation of Hypatian warriors. The Queen has decreed it so." Buck blinked, hardly daring to believe it. I am honored beyond words," he managed. "But what of the war? The fight against the Hive?" "Fear not," Bryn said. "Even now the Queen musters our armies, ready to join the battle at your side. The might of Hypatia will be unleashed, and together we will drive the bugs back into the abyss." Buck felt a fierce grin split his face. For the first time since Juno Colony, he dared to hope. With the Hypatians as allies, they had a chance. More than a chance, they could win. And he would be there to see it through, with Alara at his side now and always. Partners in war, in life, in love. The prophecy had spoken, and the galaxy would never be the same. The war was long and brutal, the losses staggering on both sides. The Hive threw everything they had at the Allied forces, wave after wave of chitinous horrors, each more nightmarish than the last. Worlds burned, whole star systems were laid waste in the titanic struggle. But in the end, the courage and tenacity of Earth's defenders, bolstered by the might and wisdom of the Hypatians, proved too much for even the bugs' endless numbers to overcome. The queen herself led the final assault on the hive's home nest, her sword cleaving the overmind in twain and sending the bugs into a frenzy of confusion and despair. Buck was there at the heart of it all, fighting back to back with Alara, their blades singing a deadly duet. They had come so far together, from those first tentative steps in the palace of Themyscira to the very crucible of war. Their bond had been forged in the heat of battle, tempered by shared sacrifice and loss, and honed to an edge keener than any sword. And when at last the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, when the final bug lay twitching in the dust, Buck took Alara in his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and gratitude and relief into that single perfect moment. They were married there on the battlefield, amid the cheers of their comrades and the blessings of the Hypatian priestesses. It was a small, simple ceremony, but to Buck it was the most profound and meaningful of his life. He had found his soulmate, his partner in all things. Together, they would face whatever challenges the future held. In the years that followed, Buck and Alara settled on Hypatia, making a home in the lush jungles that had once tested their mettle. Buck smiled as he looked out over the verdant expanse of the Hypatian wilds, his arm around Alara's waist, their daughters sparring playfully nearby. This was the life he had always dreamed of, even if he hadn't known it. A life of purpose, of love, of unbreakable bonds. A life among the stars with the most remarkable woman he had ever known. It had been a strange journey, full of twists and turns he could never have predicted, but he wouldn't have traded a single step. For all of it, the triumphs and the tragedies alike had led him here. Home, where he truly belonged. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder, her amber eyes soft with contentment. "What are you thinking, my love?" she murmured. Buck pressed a kiss to her fiery hair. "Just marveling," he said, "at the strange workings of fate, at the incredible life we've built together." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. "Thank you, Alara," he said softly, "for everything, for believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself, for fighting at my side and never giving up, for showing me what true strength really is." Alara smiled, reaching up to cup his cheek. "You give me too much credit," she said. "You had the strength inside you all along. You simply needed to find it." She kissed him then, long and deep and full of promise. "And I will always be here to remind you of that strength," she whispered against his lips. "Always and forever, my beloved." Until the stars themselves burn out, Buck held her close, marveling at the love and trust and unshakable faith he saw shining in her eyes. The same love and trust and faith he felt for her, with every fiber of his being. "Until the stars burn out," he echoed, sealing the vow with another kiss. "And even beyond, for you are my stars, Alara, my sun and my moon and my guiding light. And I will follow you into eternity." And there in the dappled shade of the Hypatian jungle, with the laughter of their children ringing out beneath an alien sky, Buck and Alara held each other, savoring the perfect, shining moment. The culmination of all they had fought for, all they had sacrificed and bled and dared to dream. A moment of purest joy, of love beyond measure or reason. The happy ending they had earned 1,000 times over. And the promise of so many more moments yet to come, stretching out before them like an endless road, dappled in starlight and ripe with possibility. Hand in hand, heart to heart, they would walk that road together. Come what may, they would always have each other. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.